Lynette, would you call the roll?
Thank you. Good morning. Today is Thursday, November 21st, 2019, and this meeting is being live audio streamed for posting on the SACOG website. Director Allard? Here. Cabalden? Absent. Douglas?
Present.
Flores?
Present.
Frost? Absent. Gallardo?
Yes.
Gore?
Here.
Harris?
Here.
Jankovitz?
Here.
Jennings? Thank you. Joyner?
Here.
Kennedy? Absent. Kozowski?
Here.
Leahy?
Here.
Lozano? Absent. New?
Here.
Onderco?
Here.
Peters? Absent. Samayoa?
Here.
Saragosa?
Here.
Saylor?
Here.
Chenier?
Here.
Slowey?
Mostly. Present.
Spokley?
Here.
Stallard?
Here.
Soon?
Here.
Pixa?
Here.
Veerkamp?
Here.
West. Absent. Vice Chair Frerichs?
Here.
Chair Sander?
Here.
And ex officio member Fong for Benny Paul.
Here.
Thank you.
All right, colleagues, before carrying on with this morning's agenda, I have breaking news. Breaking news. So, as you know, the board took action on Monday. This is straight from staff. November 18th at 10:30 a.m. to adopt the 2020 Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy. Thank you all for your participation, by the way. By 5 p.m. that day, we received Caltrans concurrence on that plan. By Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., we received approval from the Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Therefore, this is my part. Therefore, a bureaucratic miracle has occurred. So we need to thank our staff. We need to thank our partners. And everyone who came together to get this done. So rather than, handshakes around this morning, I think we should do like a high five here to the right, high five to the left.
Yes.
A virtual high five to staff who is here and did an unbelievable job getting this done with all sorts of contingency planning and option planning. And I think in honor of this great achievement, board, with your concurrence, we should give all of them next Thursday off. I think that's the least we could do. And, board members, you worked hard on this too, so by my authority, I'm going to grant you Thursday off. That works. I actually have special power to do that because my birthday is November 25th. And when I was born, the country had Thanksgiving immediately after that. So I'm imbued with a special sort of Thanksgiving power. But we are very thankful to have accomplished this. And James, I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but I don't have words enough really to praise staff on how we got through this sort of horrible situation we found ourselves in and got to this almost impossible place.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chair Sander. And if you all remember, I know we've been talking about the safe vehicle / one nation rule for some time now. It goes into effect on November 26th, and when the staff came back to me about a month and a half, 2 months ago, saying there is one way that we potentially could maybe make this work, but it's a real Hail Mary. We've got about 5 business days to get all our approvals. We thought, well, we should at least try. And we tried to kind of manage your expectations on this, but I'll tell you, it is the benefit of having an incredibly professional staff. I did very little other than give the thumbs up on this, and they did all the hard work of basically pre-arranging and working with our partners ahead of time, spending a lot of late nights and a long weekend over Veterans Day, making sure we did not compress any kind of review or public comment period, and I want to be really clear about that. We stuck to our public review process, our agency review process, our EIR comment process, but we basically compressed and did as much as we could ahead of time on all of these approvals. And it's one of the reasons I really love coming to work every day is that you have a staff that is able to do something like this. So they deserve a tremendous amount of credit for this.
When I signed that document on Monday, I was signing basically a $30 billion plan. And a few of us, as our past board chairs, may have done that. If you're the right year, you would sign the plan, that shows that we're going to spend $30 billion. I stole that from my friend Lucas here because of this emergency. but that is a giant accomplishment for all of us. So congratulations to everybody. Now we're apparently gonna have all this free time in the next 3 months.
Commercial corridor task force.
Right, commercial corridor task force.
Well,
Very good.
I don't want to give you any asterisks or caveats, but I do want to make sure you're aware of what happens now, right? So the federal approval on this was the thing that we really thought was going to be tough. And this, as you remember, and we've been really appreciative of our partnership with PCTPA and El Dorado CTC, it allows us to skirt the conformity issues around the air quality standards for now. It allows projects to proceed. Our plan that you adopted on Monday does reach the 19% greenhouse gas target from the state. The Air Resources Board still has to sign off on that. And that is the final step in all of this. They have to review our methodology. We will submit to them a pretty thick set of materials that shows how we believe we can get there. As I've told you all, it's not going to be easy to get there, but we believe we can do that if we have a lot of policy change, a lot of help, if we embrace innovation, technology, and all the other things we've talked about. But that is the final step on the 19%. And ARB certification is important to then for us to have a sustainable community strategy, which then allows us to go out next year and get, in the next 3-4 years, get competitive grants through Senate Bill 1. So I just want to make sure you understand what's next, and there's a final step in this. And of course, as I said on Monday, the other piece of this, of course, is implementation. And our plan actually puts, I think, a stronger emphasis, again, credit to staff, on implementation of this plan this time around. What's going to happen in the next 12 months to 5 years for us to actually make good on this kind of promise. So that is not just SACOG alone. As we've said many times, it takes not just a lot of our public agency partners, but it will take a much tighter relationship with our private sector partners. And the public. So stay tuned. We hope to have a final, laid out, graphically appealing version of this plan at your January board meeting. And we're also talking about trying to really synthesize the implementation piece, if you will, kind of the business plan for the larger strategic plan, also early next year.
All right. Any comments on that? Seeing none, we're moving on to public communications. This is the time for anyone who wishes to address the board on an item that does not appear elsewhere on this agenda to have a comment. I have one card turned in. Mike Farnbaum. Welcome back, Mike.
Good morning, and thank you. To piggyback on what was just said, as I prepared my notes for this comment period, I want to thank SACOG on several fronts. First of all, I want to thank SACOG on the presentation on the challenges of regional mobility, which was presented a couple months ago at the Yolo County Transportation District Board of Directors. James came up to make a thorough, complete presentation on it, and it really shed a light on the challenges of regional mobility ahead. If you hadn't seen the presentation, once you see it, you'll be wowed by what is involved in all the information presented in that. Also want to thank SACOG for holding the variety of unmet transit needs hearings that they held this season. The unmet transit needs hearings occurred in the Sacramento Regional Transit District Auditorium, Galt, Civic Center. They occurred in Davis, Yuba County, and the final one was in the city of Elk Grove. There's a lot of interest on that matter and topic. A lot of comments have been received, and staff are working diligently dissecting everything that has been presented to them and the stakeholders, and will provide a report to you in January and a final approval in February. And also want to thank SACOG for their involvement on airport bus financing. SACOG was a key party and stakeholder in recognizing the challenges of existing public transportation conditions to the airport, and worked very thoroughly to get an item just on Monday at the Sacramento Regional Transit District Board of Directors. And the Route 142 has been approved and will take effect on Sunday, January 5th. It will help the frequencies between downtown and the airport with a lot of open minds of having to know where other destinations people might come from in the future to get to and from the airport. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, to what you just celebrated, thank you to Clint Holtzen of your staff for being the lead on the plan that was approved on Monday by your board. Thank you to everyone involved in that. It was just a lot of work, and congratulations and celebration to everyone, and have a happy Thanksgiving. I'll be here on the commercial corridor report later.
Good, thank you, Mike. All right, before we take up the consent calendar, I want to point out to you a form that is in your packet this morning. This is for committee selection next year. Our board chair will make appointments to committees. Please rank your top 3 and then indicate whether or not you're interested in serving on the Commercial Corridor Task Force. So rank your top 3, 1, 2, 3. 1 being the top pick, 3 being the least popular pick. I say that because often people will put the most points on what they want. And finally, the commercial corridor is on there. Lynette, this says looking for public sector partners. Are we actually looking for private sector partners on this form? Private? Yes, so where it says look for public recommendations for public sector employees, that's actually, think of developers, private sector partners, something like that, for potential membership on the committee as opposed to public. All right. Another
Mr. Chair, we'll have more information on that on your item, your info item on the task force itself, yes, but that should say a variety of stakeholders.
We are gonna move on to the consent calendar. Does any director wish to remove an item from the consent calendar?
Move approval, Mr. Chair.
Second.
Motion made.
Second.
Motion seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that takes care of consent. We're moving on to action items. Item number 6. And Greg, you're up for this.
Thank you. Greg Chu on the SACOG housing team. With me today is Dov Hayden and Tina Glover. So today's a major milestone in the regional housing needs allocation process arena. The board, since in 2018 and 2019, has had 14 items related to housing, many of them on RENA. So today's action, the board is being asked to select and adopt one of the 4 methodologies. I'm going to quickly go over what the RENA process is, just to recap it, mainly for the audience's sake. RENA is a state law requirement. The intent of the law is to make sure that in California we have enough housing for all economic income categories. The way it works, 3-step process. First, the state, through the Housing Community Development Department, identifies the amount of housing units that we as a region need to plan for. That number is 153,512 units between 2021 and 2029. Then it comes to us. This is what we're here for today, is we adopt a method or formula for how to distribute those numbers to each jurisdiction. Then from there, your jurisdictions will take the allocations and then create housing elements to address where there's enough land to zone to meet the allocation provided. So the process, in addition to the board meetings, we've been meeting with your staffs. We've met with every one of your staffs throughout the process individually. We've met at the county level to talk at each county level. And then most importantly, we've met 9 times with the housing planners from throughout the region to develop the different methodology options that are before you. In addition, we've been to any public interest groups that have concern about the RENA process. We've been to your managers, and staff has been out to more than a dozen city council, board of supervisors, and planning commission meetings in the last year. Quickly, the process is with Monday's major action on adopting the MTP SES. That's our best guess, best understanding of growth in the region. We take a proportional share, so if a jurisdiction's X% of the MTP SES, then it gets X% of the 153,000 RENA number that the region got. From there, the question is, how do we divvy those total numbers by each jurisdiction into the 4 income categories? The lower 2 income categories, the low and the very low, which is combined, are 80% of median family income or lower. How do we distribute those, and those numbers are the amount of units your jurisdictions will need to zone multifamily higher density. There's 5 objectives that the state requires that we have to have in our methodology. The 2 in blue are covered in the MTP SES, but the 3 in red are the ones that we focused in on: balancing jobs and housing, regional income parity, which is looking at income distributions throughout the region, and then the new one based on the new law is affirmatively furthering fair housing. Those are areas of opportunity, opportunities for good schools, jobs, transit, and so forth. So the way the formula works is 40.7% of the region is in the lower income categories, so all jurisdictions start with that number, and then we adjust based on those 3 income factors, or those 3 adjustment factors. So for instance, a wealthy community, because it has fewer lower income households, would get an adjustment upward in its lower income category. And for the affirmatively furthering fair housing adjustment, those are areas of opportunity. So oftentimes areas that have good schools and transit and jobs and so forth are less likely to have lower income households. Those adjustments would go up. The staff, working with your staffs, have presented and you have released 4 options for the methodologies based on the 3 factors. The question is how much emphasis we place on each of them. Option A has a high emphasis for all 3 factors. Option B has a moderate emphasis, and options C and D have a hybrid between high and moderate. On Monday, in addition to the board adopting the MTP SES, we also received a letter from the Housing Community Development Department stating that all 4 options that are before you meet the intent of the state law. So the board is clear to accept and adopt any of these 4 options. The recommendation before you is option C. That places a moderate impact on the regional income parity, while high impact, high adjustment factor on the affirmatively furthering fair housing and jobs housing fit. Main reason, twofold. One is the regional income parity and the affirmatively furthering fair housing are often could potentially overlap. So there's potential. So for instance, a wealthy community often has good schools and jobs close by and so forth. So we wanted to moderate one of those factors. This, in our opinion at the staff, reflects the opinions of your housing staffs, the collective nature of what housing planners would like to see. So where we are today, in September, the board released the 4 options for public comment. In October, the board had a public hearing to accept comments, to hear comments, pro, con, about any of the 4 options. Today, the board will adopt one of those. After that, the appeals process starts. 45 days after today, on January 5th, is when any individual's jurisdiction may appeal its allocation. From there, the SACOG staff will release to the housing planners any appeals that we receive, because the RENA process is a zero-sum game in that if a jurisdiction's allocation is reduced through the appeals process as determined by the board, then that means it has to be redistributed to the other 27 jurisdictions in the region. So 45 days after we receive the letters, jurisdictions have 45 days to comment on the appeals letter. In March, the board will be asked to hold a public hearing to hear comments on it, but not take action, to just hear it and consider it. Then in April, at its meeting, is April 16th, not the 23rd, there's a typo there, the board will resolve what to do with each and every appeal that it receives. It could accept it, it could deny it, it could take its action. What is fixed, that's the appeals process, and that is fluid. It's fixed on the assumption that today the board takes an action to select and adopt. However, if that action isn't taken today, the appeals process, everything that's in the blue, would slip by a minimum of 90 days because of going back to the HCD for review, public comments, etc. Also fixed because of the MTP. 6 months after the MTP is adopted, we have to adopt the Regional Housing Needs Plan, which finalizes everything. So after the appeals process, then the board is asked to finalize in the form of a plan the final allocations, and that would finalize the allocations, plus it would close out the RENA process and then start the housing element process for your jurisdictions. And the key date in all of this is in May 2021. That's when your housing elements are due. So regardless of when jurisdictions receive their allocations, the individual jurisdictions must have their housing elements completed. So we know that in the appeals process, if a jurisdiction were to appeal, there's two bases in state law that are categories for appeal. First, if the RENA objectives and factors which are stated in state law aren't adequately considered or furthered, a jurisdiction could make its case based on that. Second category is if there's an unforeseen circumstance that has changed and that jurisdiction before you would need to explain why that would be the case. If the amount that the board agrees to change is less than 7%, and 7% is 10,745 units. So if it's less than 7%, then it's just proportionally redistributed to all the other jurisdictions. If it's more than 7%, then it would have to come back to the board for a formula for how to distribute the amount that the board has agreed to change. And again, this is a zero-sum game. We have to have 153,512 units regardless of how it's distributed in the region. So we know the RENA process can be challenging for jurisdictions. We've heard that. This is my third cycle now. But we want to be, SACOG wants to continue to help jurisdictions any way that we can. So we've been helping jurisdictions. You've all are entitled to the SB2 planning grants. Many of you have already received your grant awards. We know all 28 jurisdictions are intending to apply by them by the end of this month. Those monies are specifically, they're state of California funds. They're dedicated specifically to local governments to help you develop your housing element and do whatever it can on the regulatory side, on the local government side to provide more housing production. There's additional funds through the governor's funding bill. These funds and the SB2 funds are unprecedented. Prior RENA cycles, we've heard jurisdictions say this is an unfunded mandate, but these additional funds will also be coming. The local early action planning grants, or LEAP funds, are very similar to SB2 funds. Your jurisdictions are entitled to that. They're non-competitive. They're specifically for getting housing going. In addition, before you in 2020 will be the regional early action planning. That's just under $7 million that'll be coming to SACOG, and then the board will have discussions about how to distribute that to throughout our region. In addition, we provided technical assistance. So SACOG has prepared pre-approved data by the state. The state Housing Community Development Department has approved all the data that you would need that's required in your housing elements. It's been all sent out and packaged to your housing planners. We've been working with HCD staff about your individual issues on housing elements, had individual meetings as well as focus groups to talk about it. We want to ensure that you get the data support you need to get the RENA credit in your housing elements. There's lots of concerns about inconsistencies and different interpretations within HCD staff. We've been running interference just to get opportunities to make sure that there's consistency within the state so that you get as much credit as you can. In addition, Mr. Corliss has been talking about the Green Means Go program and the Civic Lab program as well. We have grant programs. We have a funding round coming up. All these are instruments to help implement the MTP SES, and by implementing the MTP SES, we hoped housing and transportation and land use all go together with that. Finally, your packet has, in attachment A, has the methodology menu. Just want to make note, page 17 shows the breakouts by the 4 income categories for all 4 options. And then page 18 shows for all 4 options the percentage of lower income households each methodology carries. Attachment B is the comment letters we received by the time the staff report was sent out on November 8th. In addition, there's a handout of additional comment that we received. And then attachment C is the response to the comments that we received by November 8th. With that, the recommendation is for the board to accept option C.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of things. First of all, I'm happy to move the staff recommendation on C, and just 2 comments, really. Number one is none of us have enough money, and some of us within this plan are a little bit beyond our pro rata share on population. So I just want us to, I've said this before, but that we consider that as we make other funding decisions down the line. The second thing is, as you know, I'm sure everyone noted, we have a $7 billion surplus in the state. The ledge analyst is recommending no more than $1 billion on ongoing funding, and it seems to me that that leaves $6 billion in one-time funding. And so I would hope that we can direct our lobbyists to work together with SACOG lobbyists to really make a go of it on housing dollars for some significant portion of that $6 billion. That we also that we just connect, because I know we're already having those discussions. So with those 2 requests, I'll move the item.
Second.
I heard a per capita split of the $6 billion, which would give us, what, about $300 million in the region, I think?
I think that's perfect.
That was part of your
Yeah.
plan? Very good.
Absolutely. The Sanders footnote on that one.
Motion made in second. Any further discussion? Mr. Allard?
I'd just like to make a comment before I cast my vote. First of all, I want to thank SACOG staff for working with our staff in Roseville in trying to come up with some ideas and some creative solutions for what the challenges Roseville faces. You all received a letter from Roseville spelling out our concerns with this item. And so before I cast my vote, I want to emphasize several of those critical concerns the city of Roseville has with the RHNA allocation that has been proposed for our city. First, let me say that Roseville is committed to the production of housing for all income levels and has demonstrated this commitment over the past 30 years. Our concerns are not based on opposition to this process. Rather, they are based on a sincere desire to produce affordable housing. Unfortunately, the RHNA allocation is unrealistically high, as we all know. The total allocation is 5,000 more units than the MTP projects will develop during cycle 6. This is a conflict that creates an impossible goal to achieve. In addition, the allocation for lower income housing accounts for 80% of the growth the NTP projects will develop during cycle 6. We all know that with the challenges it takes to make affordable housing pencil in any community, to think that 80% of new growth will be in affordable housing is a wish more than it is reality. It's also 60% higher than it was in cycle 5, and nothing we see in the economy, government funding, grants, or legislation would lead us to believe that this is achievable. Our initial assessment shows the city will need to find land for an additional 2,300 low and very low-income units. This is another scenario that is impossible to achieve since existing development agreements and constraints were not taken into account. Virtually the entire western side of the city of Roseville is encumbered by development agreements or is protected and preserved from urban development. The city cannot unilaterally rezone any of this property, and developers have been unwilling to voluntarily accept higher density residential zoning. As we look ahead, even the most optimistic evaluations by city staff show the city will fall 900 units short of its allocation. The state's no net loss policies will most certainly compound this situation. This is concerning at any time, but especially now that our state's focus on affordable housing, something Roseville has developed for the past 30 years with our requirement for 10% affordable housing in all new projects, which is rather unique in the region. It's concerning because this allocation alone places Roseville's housing element in jeopardy. This means that despite our intentional focus and strong results, the unrealistic goal could potentially put our state funding in jeopardy, leave us subject to fines, and could generally curtail our city's ability to produce any amount of affordable housing just because we can't demonstrate capacity for the unrealistic amount that's been allocated to us. California residents deserve to have access to housing. We all know that. We all agree that. And we believe this allocation is counterproductive to that goal. Roseville has a strong policy and track record of producing affordable housing, as I mentioned before. In the past 30 years, we produced nearly 3,000 units. We've been applying our remaining redevelopment agency funds to spur affordable housing production in our city, including 3 100% affordable housing projects in our downtown and Old Town that will provide over 200 affordable units. Unfortunately, as you all know, the loss of redevelopment agency funds has removed a critically important tool to meeting the goals without adjusting the goals themselves. And I would strongly suggest that SACOG makes some kind of redevelopment to a top priority for us in our legislative efforts, because estimates are that about $2 billion in funding that could be made available for affordable housing construction each year was taken by the state and used for what? Anyway, having expressed my concerns and my opinion, I wanted to go on record with these concerns. For the good of the region, the good of SACOG, and with strong anticipation that with SACOG's help and support, we will be able to resolve the inherent problems that exist with the allocation. I will vote yes today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Those comments could be seconded by other people sitting around the table.
Second.
Third.
I think it's important that we acknowledge Councilmember or Mayor Allard's comments, and I appreciate that because as I've been talking with my colleagues, we know we have to do this. We know we have to adopt this plan. It is very frustrating when you look at these numbers and know that we can't achieve this. We would love to achieve it, but the way the market forces are, the way the system is set up, the way that it is expensive to develop and we don't have any brakes on the cost of development, makes it really difficult for our private partners to be able to develop the affordable housing that we'd like to have. So I just appreciate those comments, and we know we have to do this, but I think one of my biggest concerns is we adopt these and we put together our housing elements, and then what happens when we've got a governor who goes in and tries to continue to mandate more things that we can't accomplish. It's just very frustrating. So I feel like we just have to acknowledge that and put that on the record because we have to do this.
David?
Yes, Tom.
I'd just like to weigh in to say that if you hear the chatter across the street, it's all our fault at the local level. We're not doing enough. We're NIMBYs, all of these things you hear over there. I think it's totally unfair. I'm not going to say that we're free of that. But at the same time, the governor in his inaugural address called on for a housing summit. It never happened. Nothing has happened. The League and CSAC together worked to do Senate Bill 5 by Senator Bell, and the governor vetoed it. And we don't have redevelopment money. We don't have the money that SB 5 would have given us. Whenever we get involved, the project costs double and triple. I mean, it's shocking to me that an apartment for a very low-income person in my jurisdiction costs upwards of $400,000. And I think Mr. Chenier told me he wished he could do it for that inexpensively in the city of Sacramento. So I'm trying to find ideas where we can engage the public sector to do this without triggering all the governmental obligations that go with government money. I'm kind of wondering if, for example, if we zeroed out fees for projects like this, and as long as they have some conditions in them, if that would motivate the private sector without triggering all the governmental obligations. But in other words, where is the state leadership on this? We're not seeing enough state leadership, and we're not seeing enough state money. So I honestly think we really need to emphasize this in our legislative work at SACOG because it's a common problem for everyone.
All right, I have a motion and a second, but I see two more comments here. Paul?
I'm going to endorse the comments of my colleagues around this table. I suspect if we went around the table one by one, each and every one of us would have to acknowledge that we are not going to be able to meet these allocations. And it leaves me wondering what it is we're doing here. It's a shell game. It's the numbers I've been given. My average permits pulled for building units over the last 10 years has been 250 to 300 annually. To meet the goal that I'm being given now, I have to double that. It's not realistic. I can zone for it, and I have. I can incentivize it, and I have, but I can't build it. That's not what we do. So as we move through what is, frankly, a little bit of a charade here, I can't help but feel dirty in this, and as though this is going to come back on us at some future date. We have no choice but to approve this and to select an option. But I suspect somewhere down the road, we'll be beaten for having agreed to the option. So I'm very concerned about this. I think we all are. I don't know what the solutions are. Money that probably will not come down from the state to assist in this. The notion of some new version of redevelopment is a good one. I don't know that I see any movement in that direction. So I'm very, very concerned about this. I too will vote in favor of it, but very reluctantly, and I want to be on the record as saying that for my community, and I suspect all of our communities, this is unachievable.
Thank you, Chair. I want to also compliment Mayor Stollard and his staff on the analysis they did on the process. Having said that, I think everyone's, feels the sentiments are the same. You've heard the comments. This is the sixth cycle, so I'm not surprised at all. I mean, we had a shortfall from the last cycle. We'll have a shortfall again. I think it just continues to illustrate that, zoning is only part of the equation. This region, I think has an opportunity to lead the way in finding or developing an action plan for affordable housing and actually how to construct it. We talk about our frustrations across the street. I believe that's just because most of the representation is in areas, whether it's Southern California or the Bay Area, where their challenges for building affordable housing is different from ours. And so I think we have a unique opportunity to try to address the problem from a financial and constructability perspective, not just zoning. And I think, the sooner we do that, I think the better off we'll be, because we all know this isn't the solution. I mean, all the comments we've heard just now that we've talked about, we know this process isn't the solution to building affordable housing. So I look forward to having continuing conversations on this topic with all of you. Thank you.
All right, any other comments? Okay, we will go to a vote. I can recommend, if you wish, you can vote by hand. That way you can signal with one hand, hold your nose with the other. That works, turns out. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye or so signal.
Aye.
Any opposed? One nay. So noted. Any abstentions? All right, very good. That was item number 6. We are moving on to item number 7. And I think I'm going to call on Mr. Stollard to present a nominations committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is happier news. I want to start off by saying that every member of the board was invited to volunteer for the nominations committee, and I would like to thank those who did and served: Matt Spokley, Jay Chenier, Don Saylor, Bonnie Gore, and myself. We were all able to meet together to consider these questions, and we're pleased to forward a nomination, Vice Chair Lucas Frericks to be our new chair for next year. And then we also invited anyone on the board to self-nominate. A few of us did, and I'd like to say preliminarily, all of them are excellent candidates, would be excellent chairs. Our selection was based on a number of things, including the fact that the person we have selected is one of our most senior members. He has been a regular participant, held leadership positions here at SACOG, and he comes from a city that has never had someone in the chairmanship. So with that, we nominate Ricky Samayoya as our vice chair for next year. Thank you. That concludes my report.
I accept, thank you.
All right.
All right.
Was that a motion?
Yeah, that'll be my motion. Thank you.
Motion made and seconded. Any discussion of the motion? All right, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Congratulations,
Abstentions?
Just want to say, I think for me, I look forward to working with, incoming Chair Lucas and his leadership and his mentorship has been invaluable. I don't look to making drastic changes in our goals. I think we're very committed to what we have currently on a long-term path. And I look forward to being strategic and intentional on how we invest our dollars so we can solve some of the issues like our housing issues and other things that are coming forward in our region. So thank you for the trust, and I look forward to providing as much support as I can to our chair and to staff. Thank you.
Sure. Lucas.
Yeah, and just a quick comment as well. I really appreciate the board's confidence in me in becoming the next chair of this organization. I would also say that clearly, just based on our discussion, actually the work that we've been doing over the past several months, but even up including this week, both Monday and today, between the MTP and also the RENA issues, we well know the challenges that we face as this organization and as our individual local governments. And there's a lot of work in the year ahead for us to continue on both of those two items, actually, but also a lot more. We've heard comments this morning, excellent comments on with regards to the issues surrounding legislative advocacy and the need for that work. That's obviously been something that's been a real priority of mine in the past several years on this board, and I think it's going to continue in the years ahead. We've been convening, you've seen the direction that we're sort of shifting in with regards to Green Means Go and doing that legislative work, which relates, of course, to our MTP. And then also, I think that the commentary about RENA particularly, but also the need for additional resources in terms of housing writ large, as well as big A affordable housing, they're all exactly correct and something that we're going to continue to work on. And I'll look forward to detailing a few more of those items come the January board meeting. Thank you.
All right, very good. We have come to the information portion of the agenda, and so we're moving on to item number 8. I think Monica has this one.
Good morning. Last month, the board approved the Commercial Corridor Task Force for 2020. The charge of that can be found in Attachment A. We wanted to bring this back because we were a little time constrained, so had no conversation at all on the task force, no time for you all to talk amongst each other or to ask me questions as well. So we know that every city and town and county in our region is struggling to revitalize commercial corridors. Beyond the impacts of the Great Recession, our corridors are still challenged by changing retail form, consumer preference, and antiquated infrastructure that cannot support the infill that they are primed to host. But they are also still places for opportunity. They can add much of our needed housing for the next 20 years. They can reduce regional commute times by increasing mix of uses and help us achieve our greenhouse gas reduction goals. They're places that can have diverse housing types and transform really to vibrant places where people want to work, live, and play, and places that we all go to visit rather than just to go and do a retail chore, like going to Home Depot. The Commercial Corridor Task Force will be unique from other SACOG committees in that it will have appointed board members and appointed private sector members. The task force will look at barriers to revitalization with focused discussions on what will it take from many stakeholders, not just from jurisdictions, from the private sector, from other stakeholders like transit, sewer and water, from parks and recs departments even, and what policy levers can be pulled or explored to really catalyze some infill development. We will be using learnings from last year's work on the TOD toolkit, the housing policy toolkit, and learnings from Civic Lab Year 2 teams. We'll look at case studies through Civic Lab Year 2 project areas, and while those corridors have a specific geography, they are very similar traits that you are all facing, whether you might be in a small rural town or in an urban core. Findings and recommendations from the task force will actually be presented to the Lunar Committee for discussion and consideration to see if there's a specific area that might be elevated to a board workshop or a board discussion. So that's really just a brief highlight of what 2020 will look like for the commercial corridor. Before you jump into a discussion, just a reminder that the pink sheet in front of you with your committee preference has a place for you to indicate your interest in participating, as well as listing any private companies, private sector organizations that you think ought to be considered by the chair of the task force for inclusion and membership. We will be asking for the executives of these private sector organizations, and both for board members and the private sector, there will not be an alternate appointed. The function will be similar to our board committee structure. So with that, I will pause and either facilitate some discussion or hear any questions.
Comments or questions? At our September meeting, a lot of your hands went up when we talked about who would like to be involved in this task force. So I assume when you fill out the form, that hand in the air will translate to a check mark on the page. But any other comments on the process going forward at this point?
I would just say I think this is a great idea. I appreciate sharing this. We all have these corridors in our communities, and if we can learn from each other on this and do some piloting, I think we're all better off.
There are a lot of things coming together, obviously, with interests at the state level, and how do you promote infill, the discussion we were just having about housing, all comes together on these corridors.
Speaking for Winners, and I have had an opportunity, of course, to be involved, but when I talked with our city manager, we agreed that we really don't have an urban core, but we have a downtown area which has vacancies, and the only way that we can utilize those is if we have seismic retrofitting. And is there any way that this can be worked into the program? Because the payback or the cost of the retrofitting is exorbitant, and the time for payback would be much longer than some of the building owners are going to live. So that's the question.
That's a good question to throw on the table, I think. Each of us will have different sort of infrastructure issues. That's kind of an infrastructure-like issue. You've got to do something to make the corridor work. Ricky?
You know, for me, Marysville, one of the older commercial streets, D Street, downtown D Street, and I'm pretty proud of it, of course, but it needs a lot of help and a lot of attention and a lot of love. I remember at a meeting, we had a lot of angry retail business owners come into our council meeting, just letting us know their frustration about homelessness. And Dan and I, we drove here earlier today, and we're dealing with, as all of us are dealing with homeless situations, and our counties and our cities are putting a lot of effort into homeless populations. But really what the business owner was kind of relaying to us is, you're putting all this attention to our homeless populations, which is great. But what are you doing about us, our small business owners in our older commercial streets? What attention are you guys paying to us? And so to me, I think this is why that's so important, that we have to pay attention to our small business owners in our commercial streets. And we have to also find ways that we can spur new growth, new entrepreneurs, new young people coming into the world who want to put together businesses plans and invest in our small corridors. And so I think, for me, that's a solution for a lot of our social issues, including homelessness and not having affordable housing, is how do we get more small businesses and how do we put a lot of attention in our small commercial corridors so we can spur that type of innovation among young people who want to maybe invest in themselves and start their own businesses. So I think that's why it's important especially for our little small towns. How do we spur that innovative spirit that we all have?
Very well said. Any other comments? All right, that was information item, so thank you very much, Monica. Great things to come. Oh, I'm sorry, Mike Barnbaum, you did have a card in for public comment on this item.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and members, I would be quite interested in serving on the Commercial Corridor Task Force for the transit riders' perspective. There are many challenges right now on our commercial corridors from a transit services perspective, and I think that working within the 6-county region through jurisdictional lines, that some of these challenges could be alleviated through transit coordination and partnership within the region. Let me give you just 2 to 3 examples. Most of them center around Placer County, but I'll try to be as regional as possible. Today's transit challenge from Sierra College to the Hazel Station is quite daunting. One cannot take a route all day from Sierra College straight south to the light rail station along the Gold Line between Rancho Cordova and Folsom. Today, a transit rider would have to take the Placer County Transit to Lewis, Orlando, Sacramento Regional Transit's Route 21 down the Sunrise Commercial Corridor to the Mather Mills Station, then jump on the Gold Line to the Hazel Station. A very time-consuming trip, if you would agree. Alleviating that would require a partnership between at least 2 counties and a couple of cities to look into a transit option that would allow for transit service along the north-south corridor between the very heavily populated community college in Rockland and accessing the transit line at the Hazel Station. Another challenge is, bear with me, so you know, Elk Grove Florin Road, South Watt Avenue, Santucci Boulevard, which goes into the West Roseville area from all the way from Elk Grove. The transit option exists, but only north of Highway 50 up to Alberta Road, along Sacramento Regional Transit's Route 84 and Route 26. There is no option north of Alberta Road, and there's no option today south of Manlove Road and South Watt Avenue. It does not exist. And a third would be Main Street in Roseville becomes Baseline Road, which becomes Riego Road out near Highway 99. Same road with 3 different names through Placer and Sutter counties. There could be an excellent airport transportation option for people in Sutter and Placer County from that perspective, but no transit option exists along the road that already does exist across 2 counties within the 6-county region. So I think we need to look at these challenges and create some opportunities as we go along. And I think that working both through the Commercial Corridor Task Force and the Transit Coordinating Committee, we can get a lot accomplished, if not over years and just months. If you would be willing to allow folks that are riders to serve on this, I can, after the meeting, confer with Executive Director Corliss, Communications Manager Hernandez, and Transit Coordinating Committee Executive Von Bechtold to serve if that is the pleasure of the board. Thank you.
Chair Sander, if I could just try to wrap this up, and
Yes.
as you said, you've got the pink sheets in front of you to solicit interest in this. Our Civic Lab program that I think you all are pretty familiar with at this point, for the first year we focused on mobility. We have access to transportation funds. You as a board put $1 million in, we leveraged another $2 million, and we've got things up and running. This topic, which was the focus of year 2 in Civic Lab, and I did direct your attention to the attachments, we had 5 of your 6 counties, 12 teams, tackled an incredibly difficult challenge, which is how do we actually bring life back to these aging corridors, especially when retail is getting disrupted, we're getting more vacant storefronts. This challenge, your teams in these 12 corridors worked really hard and have prepared plans, and they want to do things, but we don't have necessarily access to those kinds of funds. So this is not exclusively about how to get resources. However, it is a big part of it, and I just want to connect your conversation on the RENA cycle, and in some ways how frustrating that is, to this task force, which really is about seeing change on the ground. How could we get a pilot instrument from the state to look at redevelopment and some kind of financing tools in these corridors? How do we bring them back to life? How do we rethink vacant retail spaces? How do we put infill housing on these corridors? These are not easy challenges and questions to answer, but the reason we wanted the task force is because both in terms of your leadership, but also the private sector and the folks that might actually do these things, we think it needs attention, it needs to be elevated, it needs resources, and I just wanted to kind of try to crystallize how important we think this is. The implementation is hard on this one for Civic Lab Year 2, and it's not exclusively those corridors, because you all have them in all of your jurisdictions. But it is, I think we believe with Green Means Go, the focus on housing at the state level, we need to really elevate this and try to bring some attention, some policy change, and some resources into these types of places.
All right, any other comments? Great, thank you very much. We are going to move on to our big workshop. Where big is better, and we're talking about big data.
Yes, we sure are, and I'm very excited to be here for that. So my first job in transportation was back in 1986. And in all that time since then, I've been really obsessed with data about transportation and how it can inform the decisions that you make as elected officials. I know in many cases we come up short in terms of providing you the information that you want and need to help support you in the complicated and weighty decisions that you have to make in terms of transportation investments. And pretty much over that whole time span, what qualified as transportation data really did not change all that much. It's analogous to snapshots. It's a traffic count here, a household travel survey there, but they're static snapshots in time of one spot on our transportation system. And it's a static thing that doesn't change over time. It's equivalent to an old photo album that you have and you can look at and remember the way it was. But just as these devices, and for anybody listening, I'm holding up my phone, have really begun to transform the world of mobility through app-based transportation options. These devices also collect a lot of data about how we all move around in the world. And that data is increasingly coming into the world of transportation data for planning applications. Many of you have probably seen examples of that in traffic studies and that kind of document that's come to you in your home jurisdictions. And it's happening increasingly. So we thought it was timely, and Chair Sander thought it was a timely time to talk about this topic in a workshop format here, and that's what we tried to do. So we've organized the workshop to give you 4 things. The first part is what I'm going to call Big Data for Transportation 101, and we have Dave Ory from WSP here to handle that part of the workshop. The second part of the workshop is to give you a couple examples of really interesting, innovative applications of big data for transportation planning projects that are relevant to our region. One of them is in the region and one of them is not, but close in. It's kind of a mega region part. The third thing we want to do is give you just a preview of some of the things that are coming up over the next year here at SACOG related to big data, and give you a little preview of that and some teasers as to what some of that's going to look like. And the last bit is we're going to hear about a Region Tech initiative that will probably dive a little bit into the big data pool, and Daniel Lowndes from Region Tech will be doing that. So I'm going to real quickly introduce the speaker for the first part of our workshop. Dave Ory is no stranger to this region. He got his PhD in civil engineering at UC Davis, so go Aggies, right? But he's also been a friend to the region in many other ways. He worked for many years at our sibling agency in the Bay Area, but since then he's moved on and taken some really interesting positions, including a position at an initiative that Sidewalk Labs, it's a subsidiary of Alphabet, did to create a big data platform known as Replica. And SACOG is an early adopter of that platform for sure, and that's one of the things that we want to give you a preview of later. But Dave is going to cover that Big Data 101 part.
Thanks, Bruce. Good morning. It's nice to be back at an MPO, and nice to had a little PTSD when the RENA discussion came up, so it's handled a little bit differently than it was in the Bay Area. So thanks for your time and attention today. So as Bruce said, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an orientation to kind of the big data world and the promise, and hopefully set the stage for what the subsequent speakers talk about. So a lot of times we talk about big data, and the question is, well, where is it coming from? And obviously, nowadays there's sensors all over the environment, right? Your car, for those of you who have newer vehicles, you probably have a GPS or an OnStar device in it, and that device is communicating and in many ways recording your location for your safety. When you take a scooter, if you take a scooter, those have GPS devices. But as Bruce said, the most promising notion of transportation planning with big data is the smartphone, because in that way we've essentially have a sensor attached to everyone in SACOG, and when you're in the SACOG region. So when you're doing transportation planning, it's nice to have information from cars, it's nice to have information from buses or from transit payment devices, but really knowing how people are moving around is kind of the promise of what we can do with data, because if we know how people are moving, it gives us the opportunity to intervene in their lives and make it better. So that device that's in your pocket, presumably it's in all of your pockets, there's a host of technologies in it, and those two technologies kind of communicate and generate data in two different ways. So on the left side of this chart is my rendering of a cell tower, and so your smartphone has a cellular antenna in it that lets you to communicate. And on the right-hand side is a bundle of technologies that I'll refer to as location-based services. So your phone has a GPS device in it, which you're probably familiar with, and that can locate you. It also has Bluetooth. If you have Bluetooth turned on, a lot of app developers are very thankful. That also helps locate you in space. And in urban areas, Wi-Fi is really also an important thing that locates you in space. So I want to talk about each of these, the data they generate, who has that data, and what they do with it. So starting with cell towers, obviously your cell phone provider, your Verizon, your AT&T, your Sprint, they want to provide a good call quality for you. When you take out your phone and make a phone call, when you take out your phone and send a text message or otherwise communicate via data, they want that signal to be as strong as possible. So there's cell towers everywhere. And when you take your phone out and you communicate, it locates which cell towers you're closest to. And it does that because they're trying to see which cell tower they should route your communication on. In so doing, because your cell phone has a unique identifier, everyone's cell phone has a unique identifier, if there's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 cell phone towers, they can locate where you are. And that, certainly the cell phone providers don't advertise this. This isn't a big part of their business, but they do sell that data. Different of them do sell that data to different partners, and some of those partners do operate in the urban planning space. In terms of location accuracy, if you're at a new shopping mall, not that there's that many of those anymore, a new sports stadium where there's cell infrastructure everywhere, they can locate your location very accurately. In a more typical situation, this data will let you locate within about 100 meters or so. So it's pretty good for looking at visitor movements, regional movements, statewide movements, but less so as the problem goes down in size. The second bundle is these location-based services. So in the same way that the cell phone providers are trying to provide a good experience, your smartphone operating system is also trying to provide a good experience. So Google and Apple, through their operating systems, are trying to provide as accurate a location as they can to the apps that run on their services. So if an app is trying to give you navigation, if an app is trying to let you know where your friend is or where your pet is or where anything is, it wants to know where you are as accurately as possible. So it uses this entire bundle of technologies. Wi-Fi is one that's particularly powerful. If you think of your phone as just a sensor for all the different open Wi-Fi connectors all over the world, you can imagine a company would map the relative strength and locate those Wi-Fi connectors all over the world. And if you locate those Wi-Fi connectors, you can locate a device because of its relative strength to different Wi-Fi signals, and you can be located really accurately. And you can demonstrate this yourself. If you pull out your phone and you ask your phone on Google Maps or something to locate where you are, it'll locate you pretty accurately in an urban area like Sacramento. If you turn the Wi-Fi off, it'll have a much harder time. And your phone may even prompt you to say, hey, if you turn your Wi-Fi on, we'll locate you a lot better. So this information flows through the operating systems, and different apps that ask for your location, they have this information. Some of the apps that ask for your location, they make money. Their business model is to sell your location. So it used to be you may have pulled out a weather app and it would have a banner ad and all this stuff, and you'd have to wait to see the weather. Now you're seeing fewer ads, but in the background it's pretty likely that weather app is selling your location. Your cell phone, again, has a unique ID. So if there's different aggregators in this market, so they'll buy your location from the weather app, they'll buy your location from the game app, and in so doing, they can start to assemble where you are. This data in an urban area provides pretty good accuracy, as you can tell yourself. You can pull out your phone. And so it does allow you to have a pretty good detail of urban movements if you're tracing people all the time. So as a very broad rule of thumb on the cell phone side, there's not that many cell phone providers, right? And so for those who do enter the market, there's a pretty large sample size. So you would expect to have a lot of data, which is one of the promises of doing work in this space. However, that data is not really sufficient to tell you about how people are walking or moving or taking transit or riding bikes. It's really good to say that someone generally lives in this city or this area. They generally work here, and we don't really know what we're doing. It's just kind of a rough scale. On the other side, on the location services, the sample sizes here are pretty small. There's just not that many apps that people are using all the time that are tracing their locations that are then sold and made available. So in this case, you'll likely get a lot more spatial detail, but you'll get much smaller sample sizes. So in this, using these rule of thumbs, if someone tells you they've got really good data from cell phones on how people are riding their bikes in Davis, you should be deeply skeptical, right? Because the sample size on the micro scale data is very small, and the geographic accuracy for the larger sample sizes is pretty big, or is pretty coarse. Now you may be thinking, well, what do you mean that there's not big conglomerations on the smartphone side that have data? Certainly Google, Facebook, and Apple have a lot of data, and that's very true. Google is running the operating system. They are passing your location through to the different applications, and they have very popular applications such as Google Maps. Facebook has Facebook Messenger, which records your location, and Apple's also providing location services to many apps. But none of these businesses are in our field. None of them are interested in transportation planning. None of them see the potential upside in transportation planning. And so those huge data sets are not generally available to our community. So there is a lot of data out there, but it's not in the public domain or available commercially. And in fact, in recent years, in recent months, Google and Apple are making it more difficult for apps to record your location. So if you use an Android phone and you updated your Android operating system the last few months, it may have told you that there was all these applications on your phone that were recording your location all the time, and it may have asked you if you still wanted them to do that. So more and more you'll see notifications on your phone saying, this app is recording your location all the time. Is that something you want? And the expectation is most customers will say, no, I don't think Fruit Ninja needs to know where I am all the time. I'm a bit surprised to know that Fruit Ninja was recording my location. And I just use Fruit Ninja as an example. I'm not sure if they're recording your location or not.
We're assuming that's a game and not like a shopping app or a cooking app or something.
That's right. That's right. I believe it's a game. And so that's good news for consumers if they don't want this happening. But for our industry, in some ways, it's kind of bad news because there's going to be less data out there that we can use to try to infer things about your community. So on net, probably a good thing. So those are the two data streams that are coming out. There's cell phone data that's going to the cell phone companies, some of whom are packaging it up as a data product, working with a third-party firm and selling it. There's all these apps, these smaller apps, not Google, Apple, or Facebook, who are recording your location so for you to play a more fun game, for you to find your dog, for you to know what the weather is where you are, and they are selling your location to third-party aggregators who are bundling it up, and those data products are available to us to do things with. That data in some way is obscured. So almost every app, certainly every cell phone provider, protecting your privacy and having a relationship with you where you trust them is way, way, way more important than having a data product for the urban planning community. We are not a particularly attractive market. I'm not sure you could say the same thing about certain advertisers or hedge funds, but for the transportation planning community, they're going to go to pretty great lengths to protect privacy in order to serve us. They generally do that in, or they could do that in 4 different ways, and I've just listed them here. I'll mention them very briefly, and if there's any questions about them, we can go into more detail. So aggregation, I've got a bunch of location movements between Rancho Cordova, downtown Sacramento in the morning. I aggregate them into census tracts, into county, into city movements. So I'm protecting privacy by aggregating. And this is how the census data does it, right? You can learn about it, a lot about a census tract. You can learn less about a census block. So that's aggregation. Anonymization sounds good, but it's really hard in the transportation space because if someone takes their kid to school and then goes to work, if you anonymize that by perturbing the location and sending the kid to church in the morning, it would be really confusing to us looking at the data what was going on. So it's really hard to anonymize data for transportation planning because where people go is really important. And once you see where they go, you know, you're kind of de-anonymizing that data. So it's really important to know that someone's going to the state capitol versus, you know, somewhere else. Differential privacy is kind of a hot topic in Silicon Valley. So the idea behind differential privacy is you can show mathematically that the questions you're asking of the data do not violate anyone's privacy. So aggregation is kind of an ad hoc rule of thumb, like a census tract, it has 1,000 people, and we're kind of guessing that if it's 1,000 people, we're not going to violate anyone's privacy. Differential privacy actually goes through the math and demonstrates mathematically that if I ask for the average income cross-tabulated with vehicle ownership, it won't actually violate anyone's privacy. And the census is probably going to go more and more to this. And the fourth one is synthesizing or modeling. So in this case, you have all the data, you look at the patterns in that data, you try to learn from that, and you create a fictional world in which those patterns are recreated. So the information is retained, but the world you're looking at is fictional, instead of real, and that can retain the information without violating anyone's privacy as a first principle, because the patterns are what you're trying to extract as opposed to the real information. In the urban planning space today, oh, please, yeah. Yeah, actually, I'll do it through an example because that's more fun. So why don't you, all of you right now, if you're willing, pick a number between 0 or 1 and 9. Everybody, don't tell anybody, but pick a number between 1 and 9. Everybody got it? Okay. If you picked 1, 2, or 3, the question I ask next, say yes. Doesn't matter what I ask, say yes. If you pick 7, 8, or 9, no matter what I ask, say no. Okay, 1, 2, or 3, yes. 7, 8, or 9, say no. 4, 5, or 6, answer honestly. Okay, so the question is, when you were in college or high school, did you ever cheat on an exam? Show of hands. Right, show your hands as per the answer, right? So mathematically, I could look at the results if we did that and calculate what share of you cheated on an exam in high school. But I could also show mathematically that anyone who raised their hand, it would be really difficult for me to say whether or not they had a higher probability of doing that than someone who didn't answer their hand, because I introduced noise into the process, right? Because if you said 1, 2, or 3, you're just raising your hand. If you're saying 7, 8, or 9, you're not. And so you were able to answer that question honestly, and I could get an estimate from it, but I could show mathematically, right, that I wasn't violating your privacy. So imagine that with just a lot more equations and a lot more detail. Does that help? Modestly, okay. Okay. Another way to think about this, if you're working at, say, Apple, and you want to understand what percentage of the people put apps in folders, Apple doesn't want you looking at how people use their phone, but they can set up a system where you could ask that question, and they could tell you statistically how many people do it, and then you could do it, well, show me everyone who's under a certain age, show me by county, show me by city, and they could continue to set it up so that you're not violating any individual's privacy. Yeah. So in our space today, there's some vendors. I'm not sure if Kevin's going to mention them by name, but we're happy to discuss them. Aggregation is popular, and there's data products in our space that use that to protect privacy. And synthesizing and modeling is also gaining in popularity and will probably be more popular moving forward. As you're worried about privacy, just getting rid of all the real data is not a bad strategy. In closing, my advice to you, for what it's worth, the first thing is whenever you're looking at data or survey results or travel model results, anything that you suspect might be true but you're not sure it's true, before you look at it, write down a hypothesis. So if we asked all the residents of Roseville what % of Friday afternoon traffic, winter traffic on 80 East is generated by Bay Area residents, they would probably say 99%. 98. If we asked Bruce Griesenbeck, he would probably say, 10 to 20%. And I would always recommend you do that before you buy the big data and convince yourself that it has the answer. Because if the big data tells you it's 95%, it's almost certainly wrong. And you should say, this is almost certainly wrong, I don't believe it. And we're pretty early in using big data for transportation, so saying this is almost certainly wrong is a totally fair position to be in. And it has a lot more credibility if you write down the hypothesis and share it with others beforehand. Doing the post hoc rationalization is something that we often do, and I think it gets us in trouble. And I can share some examples of this type of approach that we've used recently in a slightly different context if you're interested. Once you've written down that hypothesis, I would assemble other information. In this region, you're very likely to have a really sophisticated travel model and capable travel modeling team, and it provides a lot of robust information. You need not always believe it, but it provides information, and if you're looking at a particular problem, you might as well examine it and see what it says. In addition to that, you have a very capable staff here who can also make judgments. So if there's a question that you think big data can inform, I would almost consider the opinions of your staff to be equally as good where we are now. So ask them, have them write it down. I think you'd probably get a good opinion. To the extent all of those agree, I would scale your confidence in that assessment based on that. So if the big data says that 15% of traffic on 80 East in the winter is Bay Area residents, and Bruce guesses 10%, and Mr. Corliss guesses 20%, I would feel much better about that estimate than if the big data just told me a number and I took an action on that. So that's my one piece of advice. Always start with some assessment of what it is before you get the information so that you can honestly judge it without just looking at the information and believing in it. And with that, I thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions and happy to turn it over to Kevin as well. Sure.
I'll state one, and it may be actually a prelude for the next speaker. It's probably 4 years ago. I was at a League of Cities meeting. I saw a presentation about a Caltrans project that I know something about, but not a lot about, and it was 80 and 65 and the rebuild that happened a number of years ago. And in the presentation, they showed this is the standard traffic modeling for what we thought we were building there and how it was going to function, and it looked great in the model. And then in application, not as great as we expected. And I don't regularly travel there, so I'm not an expert on that intersection. But what they then showed was, here is cell phone data showing how people are flowing through this intersection. And rather than the movements on and off 80 or the movements on and off of 65 at that juncture, the cell phone data that they presented said the problem isn't there, the problem is stoplights north on 65, and our previous model totally missed that. Cell phone data makes it obvious that's the bottleneck.
Yep. Yep.
You know, but they were showing the cell phone data as if it had relatively good specificity for people traveling first on 80 and then, I guess, ending up north on 65 by tower-to-tower handoffs. Is that a reasonable interpretation? I mean, a possible interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, in an extreme, if you imagine a rural, not a rural, but a suburban interstate where there's vehicles moving fairly quickly, and you're seeing them over and over and over again via cell tower, or it's more common in that situation that you'll have commercial vehicles that have software on them that are letting them know, if the drivers are behaving. That's probably right now the richest source of vehicle trajectories that's publicly available. The trajectories from the automobile companies who are trying to keep track of you to keep you safe are also very accurate, but they don't have a same kind of, they're not in the commercial market. So yeah, if you looked at that data, my guess is it would be some combination, mostly from fleet vehicles, and those fleet vehicles are a sufficient sensor for monitoring roadway conditions. Where that starts to fall apart is if you're trying to say, well, I don't just care about the cars, I care about what kind of people are going through there. Like, show me the residents of here versus there. That's where the data breaks down. But in terms of having sensors monitor roadways, that's been a big data success, and I think will continue to be, because you've got these fleet vehicles or these probes, that you can put in the system.
So they sort of demonstrated at that point, if we'd looked at that, if we'd had available that data when we were planning this, we would have planned it differently.
I think that's probably right.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, any questions? All right, Bruce, I think we'll move along. Thank you.
Yeah, so our next speaker is Kevin Johnson from Fair & Peers Associates. Fair & Peers is, and Kevin at Fair & Peers does a lot of big data applications. He's sort of a specialist within their shop. And I think he's worked in some cases on applications you might have seen, but he's going to talk about a couple applications relevant to our region.
All right, thanks a lot, Bruce. Gotcha. Perfect, thank you very much. So before I get started, I really just wanted to emphasize two things that David talked about, which I think are really, really important. And one is that big data is actually a very new thing, especially in the space of urban mobility, planning, et cetera, that I consider myself a very early adopter, and I only started working with it in 2012. So this is something that is evolving, and is going to be something that I think is going to become used and very commonplace in the future, but we're just not quite there yet. I mean, travel models, I don't know the exact date. I definitely wasn't born yet, but I think have been around since the 60s. They've had a long time to evolve. They're a data source that, I think people tend to understand. The other one is beware the oversell. I can't emphasize that enough, that one of my roles at Fair and Peers is to evaluate and talk with all the vendors that are out there, really get an understanding of what their data products are, what their limitations are, what their advantages are, and to really think about how we can start incorporating that data into our multimodal planning studies. And so today I'm going to talk about 3 of those studies, but before I begin too, I also just wanted to show kind of what the data really looks like once it gets to some of these people who are selling the data. And that's these purple and kind of teal dots on the screen that you can see there. David alluded to the fact that they're cellular, Wi-Fi, GPS data. They definitely have their different spatial resolutions, but essentially each of them represents a point in space. And there's a level of uncertainty with that point. And the only things that really are fairly certain is that unique device ID and then the timestamp or when it's occurring. Latitude and longitude is then where things get a little bit iffy. As you can see, the purple dots, I believe, are cellular-based data, whereas the green dots or teal dots are GPS. So you can see, if you want to know if someone was in the capital versus, a restaurant a block or 2 away, you might not know the answer or where they really are if you're relying on the purple data. But the teal data can give you a pretty good sense. But as David also alluded to, there's sample size differences between all of these. So the incorporation of different data sources is something that's very important to really start to be able to answer some of these questions that we're trying to use the data for. And so the first project that I'm going to talk about is the Alameda County Integrated Rail Market Assessment. And this is a mega region study to try to understand what person travel patterns are through this one particular area of the Bay Area. And we were really presented with a big problem when we sought to go after this study, and that was going to be, how do we really get an understanding of what the potential rail market is in this area? That people come through this area from 3 or potentially even 4 different regions, and there's not really a model that encompasses this entire area. That really it would be this process of piecing together information from these various models, and as we know that the closer you get to edges of models, the less certain of the data you can be. And so we thought this would be a really great opportunity to utilize big data to really get an understanding of who's traveling through this area, where trips are originating and ending in this area, and really just try to get a sense of what that potential rail market looks like for planning studies. And so we were able to take data from a variety of sources and combine them and then present to all the stakeholders, the clients, et cetera, and to really try to get an understanding of what is really going on in this area. And part of that was actually taking traditional sources such as traffic counts. It was taking ridership data from transit providers and really just trying to get at the end of the day, what do these markets actually look like? That one data source is going to say this, for instance, the counts. It's going to give you an absolute measure of people going across the Dumbarton Bridge, but a count's not going to give you anything about the origin and destination of that traffic. Likewise, you can utilize transit counts, but that's going to tell you who's taking transit today, not necessarily what is the size of the potential market, which is what's really important. And so we took all that information, including information from the model, and we analyzed them all and combined them and then presented a range of what we think is going on with the goal of estimating person travel and really getting a sense of where are these people traveling, and then looking forward as to how might we then develop or expand or enhance the current transit system to serve these people and to cost effectively serve these people. And as you can see, our analysis actually estimated that there's about 1.6 million person trips traveling through this region. And so it's a very, very large market that could potentially be captured if you use the right information. The second project that I'm going to talk about is the Sacramento-Placer County Gateway Project. This was a project where there were, I believe, 10 segments along 65 and Interstate 80, where we tried to understand what the travel patterns are, where people are starting, where people are ending, what neighborhoods are interacting with each other, how do trip lengths vary. So this provided a really good empirical data source to really try to understand who the users are of different sections of Interstate 80, 65, You can get this data for bottlenecks and really get an understanding of how people are traveling along these freeways and then what their trip lengths are. Obviously, SB 743 is a very hot topic right now. It's something that traditionally in models, I don't always have the most confidence in, that typically trip lengths in models are derived from surveys of basically bin distributions of people's trip lengths, that they largely ignore unique uses or the differences in where uses are located. That typically we're applying this histogram of people's trip lengths, and then the model tries to then fit all the trips within those histograms. So the next example I'm going to give is a study that I did up in Napa. Napa has a lot of agritourism travel, obviously, a lot of wineries. I believe there's about 434 wineries in Napa County. That's a lot of people coming in, and that's not something that models typically capture. Visitor travel is really one of the big gray areas in modeling right now. That, quite frankly, a lot of times modelers will actually factor up truck trip matrices to account for visitor trips, that their patterns can be very similar to one another. And so really utilizing big data to understand what visitors to Napa County are doing and how they're moving through the space was very important, and then to try to get an accurate estimation of VMT by jurisdiction. Trip lengths, as you can see, we were actually able to show what not only how the average trip length varied by jurisdiction, but how the histogram distribution as well by the cities, whereas in a model would likely just try to fit every city into the bin and probably get an inaccurate representation of VMT. I had mentioned too that spatial location matters a lot for trip lengths, so we also were able to go in and look at individual zones. One is a large shopping center more in the north central part of Napa, and one was then down in American Canyon, and you can see that they're utilized by completely different people and have very different trip length distributions and average trip lengths. The one in more the central area of Napa was obviously serving a lot of the local residents, whereas the one in the south or in American Canyon was actually serving mostly people from outside the county who were traveling a much longer distance to get there. So not only is that important for planning purposes, they're actually doing a study along State Route 29 through American Canyon right now, and so understanding the length of the trips and where they're coming from is important. But likewise, the other study, that this is primarily a local serving retail establishment, is also very important to understand for planning as well. And I just wanted to end with a few key takeaways, and David touched on a lot of these, but I think they're really great, so I'm going to mention them. That mobile device data is a very, very large sample of empirical origin destination data that can be supplemented with more traditional sources, traffic counts, census information, California Household Travel Survey, et cetera. That very generally speaking, it can be a very low cost per sample. I've conducted a lot of surveys. Surveys are very, very expensive. You can send out a lot of mailers and maybe only get about a 1% response rate and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially for a 1% response rate. But really the way that Fair and Peers, and I think others are starting to look at the data, is it's really just another tool in the toolbox. That there's a lot of data sources out there now, and there's going to be even more over time, and that combining all these sources is very important, and then understanding what the individual limitations of each of those data sources are, and that when you actually then present these results, that you're recognizing that there's not only uncertainty in the data, but in the real world there's uncertainty. You have new technologies, TNCs, potentially automated vehicles one day, that really the future is not, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty moving into the future, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the data, and so we need to start thinking about that when we're doing our planning. One more that I put up here as well, data pool design is very important. What I mean by that is a lot of these data providers, you either take shape files of data and send it off to them, and they send you the data back and you don't really understand what went on, or some of them are starting to have these web portals that you can go on and design your study. But we've found that you can actually get different answers depending upon how you design the data pool. That I jokingly call it the donut problem. Someone in my company was doing a data poll one time, and I think it was for Stanford or something like that, and basically the information they were trying to capture, they weren't getting out of their data, or they were getting a very nonsensical answer, and they were just ready to throw the data out the window and say, what, big data is worthless, I'm not even going to use it. And it took me about 5 seconds, and I took one look at it, and I said, oh, you actually designed the donut when you wanted the donut whole. So you were actually completely missing exactly what you were trying to get at. And so then they just basically inversed the data poll and got information that was much more in line with the original hypothesis that they had written down when they started their data poll. So obviously I apologize, that's a little bit of a plug for bringing consultants in, but it is something that's very important, and I can't tell you how many times I got brought in on a call with the city of Detroit a few months back. They were having real problems with their data too, and just really trying to explain, you're actually not doing the correct data poll, that that the data's there, it's just you need to think about a better way to go about it. And then in conclusion, because I'm also a modeler, this data integrates very well with travel models, and I really see it as a great opportunity moving forward to improve all of our travel models. And on a closing note, that's CRO 6580 project you were talking about. I think I might have actually made the figure that you saw. I was very heavily involved with that project, and I can tell you we were very early in the adoption of big data at the time. And looking back now, however many years ago it was, I definitely think there were some limitations in the data, but I think that the approach that we took and some of the findings from it are still very solid. But that now, with what we know about the data and the bigger sample sizes, it's questions like that we'll be able to answer much better and with more certainty in the future.
Maybe that was your presentation. I don't
Actually, I
recall.
was wondering if it might have been. The figure sounded very much like
Yeah,
my figure. So.
your Fair and Peers is likely, your firm that would do something like that with your reputation. And it was very enlightening at the time because it was sort of showing, standard design versus informed design of the same facility.
Yeah, and I think one of the big issues actually was the Galleria Mall in the model, that it was because of a lack of a trip purpose / land use type, it wasn't being treated as a regional draw. And so a lot of the trips were coming from local, when in actuality, all those thousands and thousands of trips it produces every day were actually coming from much further away and a lot more from the east than the model had predicted. So you would have actually undersized a lot of the facilities coming from the east if you just relied on the model. You incorporate big data, it actually shows there's these demand flows that you're completely missing, that if you don't size, you'll have huge bottlenecks or people taking other routes that you weren't expecting.
So you could build a massive project and miss it.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. But
all right,
yeah,
comments, questions? Yes, sir.
So given that we were instructed to be skeptical,
yes.
in the Napa Valley example, okay, what percentage of the data that you're relying on to develop this model is firsthand observation versus big data sources that might be less than reliable?
So that's a really, really good question. And I should start out by mentioning that this was technically an update to some work that we did 3 or 4 years ago. And 3 or 4 years ago, we relied strictly on GPS data, which had a very, very small sample at about 1 to 2% of trips, but it had very, very good spatial resolution. And we supplemented that with traditional sources, actually a license plate. So we actually collected license plates all around the county. We sent out a mail survey. We got an extremely low response rate for about $80,000, which is very unfortunate. But we basically put together very similar information back in 2014, I think it was. And so we kind of used that as our first comparison point for all these new great innovative data sources. We recollected traffic counts. We got in a lot of stakeholders. We would have, TAC meetings where I would present the results and basically ask, do these generally make sense to you, putting down the hypothesis. And so what you're seeing there is actually almost entirely from the empirical data, but it's been compared to the travel model, it's been compared to people, and when we did see something that was maybe a little bit off, we did refine the information based off judgment to make sure that what we're presenting actually makes sense to people, because we recognize that there is, a lot of potential limitations of the data that went into creating some of them.
So there's some art form here.
There is.
Okay.
We're definitely introducing art, but as a modeler, I would say modeling also is very much an art these days, and so.
So given that, the limitations that you're working with in this instance, what is the sort of plus minus on these average trip lengths in your mind?
So typically, and I haven't really thought about it in terms of average trip lengths, but in the origin destination data realm, I generally say about plus or minus 10 to 15%.
Okay.
That's once again a very anecdotal rule of thumb.
Okay.
We try to calculate a rough sample size there by what they refer to as a middle filter. For the modelers in the room, a select link. But what we like to do is we like to collect traffic counts all over the county. We did all the gateways, we did it in all the major cities, and then we isolate a roadway using the location-based service / GPS data. And then we look at how many samples that the streetlight data actually produce. And we, of course, expect it to vary. And in rural areas, we expect a lower sampling rate. And what it does is it gives us at least a sense of what our overall sample rate is and are there any potential biases. And this was actually from Marin County, but we actually did this on the Golden Gate Bridge, and we got this astronomical sampling rate on the Golden Gate Bridge that was far different than anywhere else in Marin County. And what it was doing was it was overweighting any travel pattern that came in from the Golden Gate Bridge. So people coming from the Golden Gate Bridge all went to San Rafael. All of a sudden, San Rafael generated like 5 times as many trips as anyone else. And we very quickly recognized it and said, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And we realized that it's probably the tour buses that everyone come in, because we were just isolating the bridge itself. So tour buses of people just do laps around the bridge, and they're probably all on their cell phones taking pictures. And so they were pinging the thing, but they weren't really stopping. So the data was picking them up as having, you know, origins and destinations being trips. So it was oversampling all the data. So we really had to think about that one and think about how to actually reduce that sampling rate to get more accurate representation. But quite frankly, something like that could very easily could be missed. And that's where it's very important to bring in other sources, travel models, people, staff, et cetera, who have an understanding of local travel patterns.
Thank you.
All right, good questions. Other questions? Tom?
I just want to point out that Bruce Griesenbach is one of our most senior staff members here at SACOG, and he pointed out to me 20 years ago he was standing next to a video camera at a freeway location, and we had other cameras at other locations to record license plates to see how many vehicles were actually passing through the region without stopping in the region, as we could find alternatives for those people if possible. But anyway, it shows how far we've come. He basically pioneered the whole intelligent transportation ITS concept here at SACOG, and look where we are today, Bruce. Can we blame it on you, or thank you?
Well, I'm not sure, but our speaker just referred to Bruce as an artist. So that, I'm adjusting to that.
I'll take that. I'll take that.
I won't take that.
I will, actually.
Oh, you will take that, all right.
So I'm going to give you a real quick preview of stuff that's coming up that is relevant to SACOG on big data. And one of them, we have a pilot that we launched this year in partnership with Caltrans and ARB to onboard Replica, which is one of those big data platforms. It allows us to do our own kind of queries of using big data, and it falls into that one of those categories that Dave mentioned in terms of how do you anonymize the data. It's that synthesis approach. We're just now getting delivery of our first instance of that product, and we'll be bringing that to you over the course of the coming year in various ways. That's part of that pilot. We also have, via the federal government and their largesse, they've purchased for every MPO and every DOT in the state access to a big data source for network speeds. And they did it because we're going to be required to use it for monitoring congestion and reliability in our region. We're finding all kinds of other really great ways of using it beyond just the federally required one. And some of that information on congestion will be coming to you in the regional progress report in the coming year. We're really finding it a useful way of identifying how congestion is changing in the region, and we're anxious to share that with you for sure. The third thing is micromobility device data. Jump bike, Lime scooter, and jump bike scooters, they're all contributing data via their data portals. We are in the process of requesting and negotiating access to that raw data, and we are going to be looking for our way to provide in a value-added way to some of to Davis and West Sacramento and City of Sacramento who are using those systems, find a value-added way that we can identify how we use that data to track the changing patterns of use of that and the impact of use of micro devices in our region. So that's going to be coming to you in various ways in the near future. And I wanted to introduce our last speaker. You could think of him as maybe the caboose on the train or the cherry on top of the sundae. I think it's really the latter. Daniel Lowndes, come on up. Yeah. So Daniel is a manager at Annexter.
You got it.
Global telecommunications company. He's a very active guy. He's also involved in Sacramento Region Business. He's the chair of the Region Technology Committee. Daniel and his committee are interested in launching a hackathon, and I'm going to let him take it from there. But it's definitely diving into the big data pool, and we're trying to be supportive in any way that we can.
Thank you, Bruce. Am I the last person between now and lunch?
Yep.
All right, we'll make this quick. Well, thank you guys for your time. Appreciate it. As Bruce mentioned, my name is Daniel, Chair of Region Technologies, and what that is it's a group of local business executives in the technology industry, and we're constantly thinking about how can we take our skill set from the private sector and advocate for more economic development, right, in the area that we serve. And so this last year, we kind of honed in on transportation and homelessness as two bigger challenges we want to address. And just being in here the past hour, we're not alone in desiring to address those challenges. And you might be thinking, all right, cool. What are you doing that we can't do, or how are you going to contribute to this, right? And so that's where we sit down as a technology industry, our representatives, and think, what is currently happening in our ecosystem now that we can do that's different? I know there's a lot of hackathons. Bruce mentioned hackathons. There's a lot of hackathons. Essentially, it's an open call for software developers and technologists to come with data and solve problems. There's a lot of those that happen on the calendar year here in Sacramento, and a lot of good ones. A lot of hackathons are often just event-based, right? You show up, you go through the exercises, and then you leave. And sometimes there's some cool things that come from that, sometimes not. But they tend to be, particularly in our area, pretty isolated. There's a lot of silos around what people are working on. And so our heart and our goal is to say, what can we do from our vantage point to bring as many people together in collaborative as we can and make a lasting impact? So what we're leaning into in partnership with James and some of the other folks that we're talking to is saying, hey, if we got a hold of some of the traffic data that might already be on your servers and already in your organizations, we got a hold of that, we organized it, and then we made an open call, right, to all the software developers and technologists and brooding computer science majors at Sac State and UC Davis and Sierra College and William Jessup, or startups, folks that are looking to make an in on this. And we said, transportation is what we want you to solve. Some of these challenges, and we're in the process of defining of what those are. And in partnership with SACOG and some of our other private sector leaders, putting together a map of an award, a financial award, but then also defining what a long-term partnership could be to see those ideas built on. And so this is an announcement of this is what we're working on, and then lastly, it's an invitation. I don't know what your interest level is on participating in this, but I'd ask, if you have a desire to participate and you've got some data you want us to look at, we would love to get our hands on that and help define that. Again, as we call these people to work on these challenges and come up with solutions, I'd love your data and your challenges to be a part of that. Because, again, this isn't about serving us. This is about serving our communities around us. And we want as many people to participate in that as possible. So I think that's it.
Great
Perfect.
idea.
Is that okay?
Very, very good.
Questions, thoughts? Are you hungry, ready for lunch? All the above. That's fair.
And if I could, I mean, I think just to build on Daniel, and I really appreciate his reaching out to us and engaging us on this. And it kind of goes along with the whole Civic Lab idea, right? Which is, could we take sort of a problem, you name it, we've got many of them, right? It could be 8065, it could be the Cap City Freeway, it could be getting state workers to jobs here in downtown and having them not drive alone. Could we get all the data we have on that issue and say, all right, we can't solve this the traditional way, we don't have enough money to solve it the traditional way, could we use data to inform us being a little bit more nimble and thoughtful and creative? And so we know here in government we can't do this just by ourselves, so looking forward to the partnership.
Thank you.
Yes.
In my early, when I left Chico State, my first round in Chico State, which I really enjoyed, and I went back for seconds. My first job was at San Jose at the Tech Museum of Innovation. I don't know if any of you have been out there in downtown. I did governmental affairs and stuff. And but I remember to this day I remember their whole mission to inspire the innovator in everyone. And I always think like that's just a simple but such a powerful idea. And the challenge of challenging the private sector or young people, whoever can come up with solutions and inspiring that innovation in people and creating challenges is really effective. And we saw it in San Jose. Of course, we see it in in Silicon Valley. But bringing those type of, that culture and that thinking that we can solve things, we can solve social problems through challenges and innovation, I think it's a great thing. So very supportive. So thank you for that.
Other comments? Questions? Bruce, you mentioned network speed. I'm getting about 13 gigabytes per second in here. Is that what we're talking about?
We're not talking about computer network speed. We're talking about highway speeds, roadway speeds.
Good.
That's all we had for the workshop. I
All
appreciate
right.
your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, that was the workshop. We are moving on to the chair's report. I gave that at the beginning of this meeting. That was the high five item. That's my report. James, you had a report for us? Board members, any reports? Darren?
Thank you, Chair. This is mostly targeted for our Sac County representatives, but for our situational owners, for everybody else. Sacramento Transportation Authority is conducting hearings, public workshops for a potential Measure A sales tax measure, doing outreach into the member communities and just so informational sessions. So for those of you who are not the representatives on STA, just to keep you aware and hope you'll support that outreach effort to educate voters. Thanks.
I think there's 3 of us left that would apply to.
I was looking around, yeah.
But you know, a role for innovation in STA's spending plan would make a lot of sense. As opposed to locking everything down for, I'm not sure what the time frame is at this point, but I heard it was going long, 40 years or something?
Potentially.
Potentially. I'm not on STA, obviously, I'm just hearing the second hand.
30 or 40.
30 or 40 years.
30 or 40, yeah.
Polling's the same.
I think the polling showed 30 is the.
No, it's the same.
Oh, is it the same?
Pretty much, yeah.
So yeah, having space in there to innovate along the way, you know, so that when the cell phone data comes along, that helps you better design the project than what the model showed, you can adapt to that going forward.
Yeah, you know, I think if you look at mobility in general, I think everybody can get around that, but then there's a lot of advocacy around the different modes. And, you know, you bring in the Altamont Corridor Express as well, and so there's a lot of conversations about the expenditure plan. So
Good.
It's going to be a challenge.
Okay, other updates? Anything? All right. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
New County opening the Hard Rock Casino, and it was a real big deal. It's great to have the casino and hotel open up, very successful. Last couple of weeks, too, successful Sikh parade. We had over 150,000 Sikhs converge on Yuba City and Sutter County this year. So talk about transportation needs and all that. Huge influx.
The roads withstood it.
The roads were just, full. So, but it worked out great. It was a very successful event this year, the most successful probably ever in the history of the Yuba and Sutter.
Pretty neat.
I'm the new Yuba City Mayor, according to Channel 40.
Congratulations.
Ricky, that's right. Ricky's the new mayor.
Might need to refer that to the nominations committee,
Congratulations.
All right, any other transportation announcements? Yes, Pierre?
Transportation for sure, the tractor parade in Winters, December 6th, 6 o'clock. At least 60, every year it gets bigger and the crowds get bigger, so you have to come early. All the tractors are lit up. Some of them, each farmer or each tractor producer is trying to outdo the next, and it's interesting. Santa Claus will be coming on one of the tractors too. So that's December 6th.
So these are historic as well as modern,
Yes,
I'm
both.
assuming?
Yeah, some of them are like 2 stories tall.
Wow.
They're the biggies.
So when I grew up, our family farm was the red variety, not the green.
Yeah.
Those two do not mix. I assume, do you have both red and green in the same parade? Because
And they'll be red and green and lots of lights and flames and all kinds of things.
Okay.
Very good. Yes, sir.
Segue, 7 days later, Santa will leave your area and come to Colfax where we have fireworks. So
yeah,
Santa with fireworks. You can't top that.
That's our parade with fireworks.
Wow, exploding Santas.
What time is the tractor parade?
6 o'clock.
6.
That's pretty cool. All right, James, I don't know how you're gonna follow that, exploding Santas and lit up tractors.
I can't. But I'll give you some dates and some important things on your calendar. So coming up the next month in December, we are only going to be holding a transportation committee meeting. We won't be holding a policy meeting, policy innovation, or a land use lunar meeting. Not enough items, but the transportation committee agenda will be full, and it will roll over into a special board meeting December 19th. We will be holding a board meeting. It's a special board meeting because we weren't sure at the beginning of the year if we would need a board meeting, but nevertheless, we do need a quorum. We would like to have you here. There's some important items. We will not have a workshop on that last board meeting of the year. We know sometimes it's a hard one to, people are leaving, they're going places, but we will have a board meeting, so please, December 19th, make sure that's on your calendar. As Chair Sanders said, you have the committee preference survey. I know we would like to get that back from you as soon as possible with the special quarter task force and your thoughts about other stakeholders. And then finally, also at your seats is the San Diego tour. So we've been talking to the San Diego Association of Governments, our peer agency down in San Diego. We think there's a lot of comparisons in terms of also the MTPSCS that you just adopted that we would like to go see. They're very excited to host us. It's one overnight, leaving the morning of Thursday, January 30th, coming back the afternoon of Friday, January 31st. So please let us know if either you can attend, would like to attend, but you need to get back to us, or just absolutely cannot. We're trying to get hotel rooms booked and the like, so.
Will Santa and his reindeer be at the board meeting on the 19th? That's clearly a transportation issue.
We're working on that, yeah. We have a GPS on him this year.
We know where he is that the deal?
Thank you, yes.
We do have some like air authority here, right? Airport Planning Commission like authorities, so objects that fly. Anything else, James?
That's it.
All right. Next meeting, December 19th. You don't want to miss the Christmas punch. It'll be here that day. Thank you all very much. We're adjourned.